So Laura and Yvette from University of Auckland are going to present us their journey in research data management at the university. And Laura and Yvette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Kia ora all. Yvette, would you like to introduce yourself while I drive? Get the slides up.
Kia ora, everybody. I'm Yvette Wharton. I'm the e-research solutions lead at the Centre for e-research at the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumata Rau. And I also work across another project around research data management, which has 3 initiatives, which we're going to be talking about. And we've been working around research data management and thinking about data management for a few years now. So it's definitely been a journey for us. So Laura, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. See, I shared the slides and it still didn't work. All right, let's do that again. Can you see my little picture of a kid with a map?
Yes. It's working now.
Excellent. So as I mentioned, my name is Laura Armstrong. I am a colleague of Yvette's now for several years in this space. Firstly, in the library within my institution, and then I joined the Centre for E-Research. I am the engagement lead. So I spend a lot of my time talking to researchers about research data in one capacity or another. And we're going to talk to you today and share the journey that we've had over the last 6 or so years. Quickly, promise. So our journey started back in 2016 when the Centre for E-Research and the library started talking about how could they support research data. We knew it was a bit of a mess. And there were lots of things we wanted to do, but our institution wasn't ready. They weren't aware of a lot of the concepts. They didn't know what they didn't know. So we spent a lot of time warming up or socializing different research data maturity related concepts. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk today about the maturity model work that we did and the stocktake and the recommendations that fell out of that came about last year. And then what we've done to move ourselves and our institution forward and create that maturity that Yvette in particular is leading the charge on to build some things that will help our community. So what are we talking about? With research data, and it doesn't resonate for everybody because we've spoken to people with all sorts of disciplinary backgrounds, and it really means a lot of different things, and they don't necessarily even use the term research data in a meaningful way. But when we talk about it, we mean anything that is created, collected, or obtained in the course of research that underpins that research. It might be physical, digital, it might be described as better as an artifact or a cultural tonga or treasure in te reo, or research evidence or digital representation of a physical thing that you require in your research or researchers require in their research. For us, that may be all sorts of different things because we are a multidisciplinary institution. So that could be soil samples, cell samples, interviews with people, images. I spoke to somebody today who spends their time gathering research data that is the electrophysiology of animal gut. All sorts of things are captured. And research data management is the process around all of that, the planning, the undertaking, the collection, the organization, the management, both before, during, and after the actual research project. So that's the kind of grounding, that's what we're talking about. We developed a life cycle approach to this. So this is really common. People use slightly different language, but most institutions have some sort of life cycle around data that they use to talk about it. And we found this really helpful in how we deliver training to our researchers, primarily to our doctoral candidates. That's where we focused our energy around socializing these concepts of what is research data, why is it important to manage it. We lacked policies in this space, so we couldn't make people do a data management plan. So as with a few institutions in Australia, we developed more of a checklist approach. And so that people who were interested in planning that and sharing that with their supervisor or with their collaborators had a mechanism to do so, but we weren't being heavy-handed about it. We took that approach because we felt that picking a system that then didn't do anything with that information, didn't keep it alive, didn't integrate it with anything, was possibly not the best use of researcher time. So we held fire and we waited so that we could have a system that would be dynamic and would be connected. And Yvette will talk more about that. We were also socializing the fair, care and Māori data sovereignty principles that our institution, after a few years, has come to the party about and is now a part of our strategic direction as a university to become a Māori data sovereignty organization. And I'll touch more on that. But we use this research lifecycle to talk to researchers so they understand what they should be doing next, wherever they are in their journey of research, to better manage their data. As I mentioned, we don't have to date a data management planning system. We haven't had, until relatively recently, funders that required it, but we do know internationally that funders do, and we have used that to ready our institution to that possibility. And we expect the big funders in New Zealand, and the big funders for us are Health Research Council, the Royal Society, and MBI, which is our Ministry of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, I think. But those big funders have yet to say we need a DMP, so we've been gentle about pushing that. We've created a template, as I mentioned, and a guide, and we do point people in that direction, but it hasn't been a huge thing until much more recently. So I said I would talk about the fair and care and Māori data sovereignty. Now, I guess it might be useful. Is everybody familiar with the FAIR data principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable? I'm going to ask David what he thinks. Is everybody familiar with that in this audience?
We have 4 thumbs up.
Yeah, excellent. Have you got the same level of comfort around the care data principles?
Care may not be so common to many people.
Yeah, okay. So the care data principles follow the development of the FAIR data principles. You can see that there's a relationship there, but they were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And they are standing for collective benefit, authority to control, and the responsibility that sits with researchers and the ethical considerations that sits with researchers in that context of managing, dealing with an Indigenous group of people and the information that you have about them or from them. Now, that came about after New Zealand's Māori Data Sovereignty principles work that was undertaken by Te Mana Raranga. And I'm going to skip forward for a second. So Te Mana Raranga is the national body within New Zealand, or the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, group of academics that have come together and formed a group that have defined what is Māori data and what does Māori data sovereignty mean in relation to Māori data. And those individuals, or many of them, were then involved with, I'm going to go backwards, the creation of the care data principles. So they are very aligned, particularly around that collective benefit being very central to how Indigenous groups, whether they be Māori, Pacifica, or in other places in the world, think of what's important around research data and the authority to control. Now, we find a lot of researchers get quite hung up on the jurisdiction aspects of sovereignty principles. You know, where is the data? It must stay in a particular location. And in talking to people who work a lot in this space with researchers, so being in the room when those conversations happen, I have come to understand, at least, that that authority to control, so within the context of Māori data sovereignty, the rangatiratanga and the whakapapa, which is how you identify that people are represented in the data, as opposed to being invisible, not present, or invisible, nobody knows they're present in the data. Those two things, along with the kahahitanga, which is that collective benefit, are for most more important, or at least you deal with those considerations first before you worry about has it left the country. Because there may be really good reasons to do a particular thing, to use a particular tool, to store data in a particular way, to collaborate with a particular group that takes that data offshore to deliver those three things. And therefore you make that compromise. But it's the right people, and in this case, the Māori people who are represented by that data, making that decision in an informed way that is more important. I'm not necessarily an expert in this space, but I'm happy to field questions about Māori data sovereignty based on the conversations that I've been privileged to be a part of. You'll see here from the definition of Māori data, it is very broad. Within the University of Auckland, we do not argue or debate that very broad definition. We have accepted it as is. So moving from the sorts of conversations we've had with researchers over the last 5 or so years, we still find that people are kind of messy with their data. And so at the beginning of 2020, we had a very enlightening conversation with our research office. We call it our Office of Research Strategy and Integrity. And they were keen to push this research data, open research, open science agenda forward. And they found that the tipping point had been reached. So we had an increasing number of funders, publishers, and ethics committees that were making requirements in this space. So most notably within New Zealand, we had our Health and Disabilities Ethics Committee were asking for specific details in ethics applications for how are you managing the identifiable data versus the de-identifiable data, and a few other questions that were quite data management planning-ish or in that direction. We also found through the work of Taumata Rau, which is the university strategy, that renewed and articulated commitment to becoming a Māori data sovereignty organisation, and that foundational relationship we have with the people of the land, the tangata whenua, and the commitment we have to the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, so our Treaty of Waitangi. We wanted to enable our researchers to collaborate, to meet the fair care principles. We have increasing pressures, as will you, around privacy laws and a concept we have here that we call trusted research. And I'm going to let Yvette tell me that it's the Data Act. Is that right in Australia? Yes. Do remember it. And we also want to just improve our capability across our ecosystem, research ecosystem. So they funded a project to find out what is the current state of research data management across the University of Auckland. They wanted us to look at that current state in relation to a research data management capability maturity model, and then make recommendations about, well, if we know where we are and we know where we want to get to on that capability maturity model, what are the recommendations? What are the things that we need to put in place to get us there? And then ultimately to write a business case, ask for some money, and here we are. So just really quickly along that process, we developed our own maturity capability model based on several that are out there. And we didn't start off hoping to do that. We did expect to use one off the shelf and then make it more comparable, but we found that none were representing that dimension of Māori data sovereignty. So we wanted to add that dimension to what was commonly a 5-dimension model. In doing that, and in having the conversations that allowed us to bed that in, we realized that for many researchers and service divisions within our institution, they found it to be too abstract, and they wanted to have much more granular detail about what will be present in my institution for me to know that we have met the next level, or what will be absent, what will have changed. So we took international models, added Māori Data Sovereignty, and then created much more granular level information specific to our institution, what was present, what was absent, across each of those dimensions, and ordered them so that you can see, in this particular case, 1.1 doesn't have a strategy. 1.1 tracks all the way through to the strategy is regularly reviewed and improved and aligned with current best practice. We did the same for all of those dimensions, and so this is the detailed view of the Māori Data Sovereignty dimension within the capability maturity model. This has been published. You can look it up, and I can share the link. So we had done that work on the model, and then we went out to our community and asked them what their practices were. So we did that through university-wide, faculty by faculty, department by department, face-to-face presentations, and then followed up with a survey and with in-depth interviews. And we were partnered in doing those interviews in particular with Whakaare Research Services. So that was a Māori-led research entity that sat in those interviews and had specific questions. And we ended up with 2 reports. One was the stocktake report. My colleague Brian, who worked at the National eScience Infrastructure, and I were on this. And then Tanya, who was, Dr. Tanya Allport, who was from Whakaare Research, she was the principal author of the second report, which specifically dealt with how does the University of Auckland step forward in becoming a Māori research organisation. Those reports gave rise to 20, which seems like a lot, and certainly our senior leadership felt that was a lot of recommendations on how to step the whole of the institution forward. I should note that the stocktake did recognise that there were pockets of great behaviour, best practice, and there were pockets of, I don't know what you're talking about. So across the different dimensions of strategy and policy, or Māori data sovereignty, or data management, there were different pockets of best practice, but as a whole, the institution was not where it wanted to be. So these recommendations were constructed around how do we move the institution as a whole to that level 3 within the maturity model. So some of the things that we got going with really quickly. So update the research code of conduct. That's still in flight. We created a new position that reported directly to our Deputy Vice Chancellor Māori, and that's the Putiaki Rangahau Māori, which is a Māori research data steward position. Not to give one-on-one advice to researchers, because there were lots of people across the faculties that could do that. It was more about setting a direction for the whole institution on what about this was important, and how were we going to operationalize those nationally understood principles that were still quite abstract for a lot of people. You know, how am I going to achieve ko te angata? Who do I need to speak to? When? About what? So they came on board in April this year, and we are in the process through that position of creating a Māori data governance structure to sit alongside, on par with the university's research committee and governance structure. So there is a Māori research governance group now. I'm going to leave the pink box for a minute. There are other maturity developments that are underway. The most notable one there is we don't have and haven't had a research data management policy. And whilst policy isn't necessarily the most interesting or obviously productive thing, it's not like your researchers can say, I now can use this thing because you've invested in it. We did find that an awful lot of researchers said, well, there is no sense of direction about what we're meant to be doing or not meant to be doing, or is this important to our institution? Is data seen as an asset or a thing of value, or is it just seen as something to delete as soon as you can? So that's probably the area that we decided we could act on first. So we have been developing since March this year, and we now have had a full draft RDM policy endorsed. It goes out to consultation across our university next month. And we took an approach where we involved lots of people across the university, but we took several exemplars from international institutions that had been working in this field or had had policy documents for many years ahead of us, and reviewed them and collectively thought, well, what structure will work for us? So we started with the responsibilities for our institution, that they are the custodian of research data, that it is their responsibility centrally to ensure that researchers know what is expected of them and how to do it, to provide infrastructure and support services to enable PIs, doctoral candidates, research assistants, research fellows, whoever they are, to know what to do, to know how to access it, and to be able to access it, and to provide training and guidance on doing so. Then we launched into a longer series of clauses that step a researcher through a life cycle to do with research data, but their obligations and requirements as far as we could get the institution to step forward with them. So we start with establishing what are the roles and responsibilities across a particular project. Have you identified and complied with, or planning to comply with, and how are you planning to comply with the constraints, whether they be ethical, legal, commercial, or sovereignty related throughout the data lifecycle, all the way through to how do we offboard people appropriately? And if you are dealing with sensitive data, but you're leaving the institution, yet you have rights to continue to access it because possibly you hold the IP, what happens to that? It shouldn't simply just travel with you, because that would be in breach of the ethics. But how do we enable you to have the access you should? And we need to work through that. But we have now articulated that as a need and put that in the policy. And then the other bit that happened more recently, but has come out at the same time, and they kind of come together like siblings, is a refresh of our data strategy and data governance documents, so that research data is now a part of that broader ecosystem of how we manage data. So previously those documents were focused on administrative or university data, institutional data, so data about who we hire, so our student numbers, those sorts of things. But we've now successfully incorporated teaching and learning data and research data into those documents so that they are dealt with as a whole, and consequently have lines of escalation and roles and responsibilities from researchers all the way up to our Vice-Chancellor around data governance and who is the steward and who's the custodian, and different roles, as I say. We've also been able to take on a nationally accepted at a government level data security classification. This is something that a few other institutions in New Zealand have done. So we're very recently had endorsed this idea that we will classify all data, including research data, as internal, public, sensitive, or restricted. Sensitive is a very large category and will likely have shades of grey within it. Restricted is something that a researcher won't necessarily pick for themselves, but will likely be told by the institution, by the contracting process or by the granting body, this is restricted and therefore it's sort of confidential secret, that kind of thing. So there aren't many cases for that, but there are some. And at that point, I'm happy to answer specific questions, but otherwise I will hand over to Yvette and we can have questions about any and all of it at the end. Up to you.
Maybe in the interest of time, we could have Yvette and then we'll have all of the questions.
Okay.
Laura talked about all of those recommendations that that we listed as part of the stocktake and what could be done. 3 of those we wrote up into a business case as a program of work, and yay, it got funded not so long ago, and we've begun that program of work. And those 3 initiatives are initiatives that we expect will provide a step change in our capability and our maturity. So a maturity uplift, particularly around data management. So that's having a connected research ecosystem that uses persistent identifiers as part of that connectedness. Having a machine actionable or a dynamic data management planning solution, something that not only helps our researchers to plan better, but also reduces their time. And anyone who was at eResearch Australasia last week would have maybe heard Josh talk about the 38,000 days of researcher time and $24 million that could be saved by not having to rekey information with a national PID strategy. So we're looking to do that across our ecosystem. Connect it more, give better planning, better insight, better ability to measure the value of different things to our institution, better governance, a sensitivity to our Māori data sovereignty concerns, and also security for at-risk data sets. So the third one was the Data Safe Haven initiative for our sensitive research data. So making sure our research data is safe, managed well, and providing environments that are most appropriate for our researchers, all with the aim of making our researchers' lives better, reducing administrative burden for everybody at the heart of it. So I'm going to jump into a little bit more detail about each of the initiatives. The first one, very dear to my heart, and I'm going to assume that most of you know what persistent identifiers are. Give me a thumbs up if you've heard about persistent identifiers. Yeah,
there's been a number of talks about that. Siobhan gave a great talk about that last year.
There you go. I don't need to tell you anything about persistent identifiers. So we think of our persistent identifiers. You have an idea for research right at the beginning. Someone has an idea, and they go on this journey, and the map of that journey is really a data management plan. So that's our navigation system across our research journey. And as we take that journey, we add persistent identifiers into, in this case, we call it a waka. So into our waka, which is a boat that we're taking our journey in. So imagine we're traveling across the seas. So we have stuff for our research activities, we have stuff for our people, organizations, different services or instruments that we might use. So we bring in the PID-inst identifier for instruments or the schema, all the way through into people giving outputs. So the idea is we can understand our impact on the world from an organizational point of view, people and equipment point of view, and we can more explicitly connect all of those things and hopefully not only help our researchers be able to say, hey, I did this bit of research with this bit of kit, you know, you could reproduce it, here's the settings that piece of kit actually had at a given point in time, but also help the facility owners so that they can say, hey, these people used our research and this is the amazing impact that it's had. So it's kind of a two-way thing. So that's really what we're trying to do with the connected research ecosystem. And then the dynamic DMP, there's been some really, or data management plan. There's been some really cool stuff I've seen last week that's been happening in Australia around making sure that we have not only a collaborative data management planning tool, but a connected tool. So automating information flow. I've used an instrument, so I can push some information about that use of instrument to my data management plan, my DMP. Again, it helps us with things like planned infrastructure investment. So what storage is someone going to use? How much of that storage might be needed? We might already know that from the data management plan, so we can predict it organizationally, we can plan for it, we can buy the right infrastructure, and we can also make sure that it's housed safely according to all of the right rules and regulations connecting into our data classification system. So that's the DMP. We also are looking to build a safe, governed, secure environment. So that's not just some VMs people can come and use. It's the data, it's the compute, whatever that might look like, the software, a space where collaborators can come in, but it also has a governance layer across it, and you know, some attestations around the security, so it's known and managed. And there are some good examples of that in Australia as well, but that's something we're looking to build for our researchers. So those are the three big initiatives, and there's actually another one that I also think is another big one, which is part of its own thing, which is around research instrument data. So alongside that, we've been building an instrument data service. We've connected in with the MyTARDIS application out of Monash, and we've added our requirements across that. So we've built a sort of an additional layer around the access controls in MyTARDIS, and also additional search capabilities in MyTARDIS. And we're looking to add research activity IDs across our instrument data service, give it an instrument identifier, so that certain key instruments that we have, certain microscopes in our bioimaging unit, for example, we can collect the data automatically off it, read in the metadata that we want, have information about the research project that it's connected to, and have one place where that information is stored for the appropriate amount of time, so researchers can access it, and also automate some of the compute requirements of that, so we can push the data into one of our Nectar virtual machines or to our NESI high performance compute locations and back again. So with the aim again of helping reporting, reducing administrative burden, reducing the duplication of our data sets, but also aging them appropriately, and helping align with our policies. So we're doing a lot of work in that research data instrument space. And particularly, we've built a instrument data wizard that goes alongside this, that makes sure that we can collect not only the machine readable metadata that we need, but also some of that experimental data that people need to record. And one of the things we're looking to do is not only pull that into our MyTARDIS system, but potentially even push it to things like the lab notebooks when people are using those. So that's the amazing journey that we are on. I think at the beginning, if you remember, we're showing someone crawling. So we're working towards that. One day we'll run. And yeah, any questions from anyone?
Thanks, Laura and Yvette. Well, as you said, it's a journey, so you have to start somewhere, and you don't know when you stop. Thanks for this great presentation. Any question, anyone? I may start actually with one in the chat. So Patrick asked if the report, I guess, on the maturity model was available. So Yvette gave the link to it. So Patrick asked if the draft RDM policy is available outside the University of Auckland.
Yeah, thanks, David. I was particularly interested in that. I'm from Monash University and we have a research data management policy, but it's 3 pages long, so it clearly doesn't cover much. I'd really be interested to see if I could get a copy of that.
And I'm happy to share the draft with you. I would say that ours is probably not much longer. We have a really lovely lady who manages our policies within the university, who got out her red pen and made us get rid of all sorts of extraneous fluffy sentences. So it's quite tight now.
Yeah, nice. Thanks.
But it doesn't like, even though, as you said, a policy is not the alpha and the omega of all of that, in data management in particular, but you still need a document that gives some sort of like objectives or general requirements on a vision or a strategy or somewhere, no?
Within the policy, we had a bunch of fluffy things to start with, and we ended up having to get rid of everything that was should sounding. And so what we've been left with is everything that we could craft into, well, you have to do this if. From a strategy point of view, we have hung an awful lot on becoming a Māori Data Sovereignty organisation. There isn't a lot of direct reference to data from a strategic point of view in that, primary strategic document for the whole of the university. There is an awful lot of work going on to improve our research ecosystem, so we relate quite a lot of what we want to do here to that.
About data sovereignty, Tanglo has a question actually. So is Māori data sovereignty implemented nationwide or just at the University of Auckland?
I'm going to dissect that question slightly. Nationwide, it's a thing, but implemented is probably not the word I would use. So all of the big research funders, so as I mentioned, Royal Society, MB, which is a government entity, and HRC, so Health Research Council, will all have references to questions about how are you considering Māori data sovereignty, or how are you addressing or considering responsiveness to Māori? Slightly different questions, but often quite interrelated.
Did that conversation
referred to, sometimes referred to as vision mataranga. So it's all of those 3 things together are feature across the nation in New Zealand, Aotearoa research sector, but different institutions have different engagement of that and different relationships within their institution to things like te marararanga. And it's not, and I've come to understand this as somebody who is a foreigner in New Zealand, it's not a one size fits all. So you can't, different iwi or tribes within Māori, so the iwi, have different views, different people will. So there is no one Māori view on this topic, which is why some of the principled approach is great and fits with that, but putting that together with, well, what is an individual researcher meant to do or not do, and when are they meant to do it in their particular context, can be quite difficult to work out. And we, for the most part, are just got training wheels on about that. Yvette, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think to answer how long we've had the Putiaki Rangahau, that was a position that was created this year and hired this year, so it's been in place 6 months, I think you could say. But the need to consider vision mataranga as part of what you're doing in your research, I think has been, you could say it's been around longer, but I think people are gaining more understanding of it across Aotearoa.
Yeah, so vision mataranga and responsiveness to Māori has been gaining traction for 10 years plus. Māori Data Sovereignty is slightly more recent.
So it's something that came because the CARE principles and understanding was basically to deal with Indigenous data governance. So that conversation started much earlier in New Zealand than the CARE principles.
Yes, so the Māori Data Sovereignty principles had been developed or had existed when that members of that group engaged with other communities, other Indigenous representatives to do the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's CARE data principles.
Levi,
and I would say we're not experts in that field, so there are people far more knowledgeable than us who would be much better to answer those questions.
but I think it's maybe a general comment in terms of data management. The FAIR principles have definitely been a lot more talked about and in general than the CARE principles, which are much newer and maybe a bit more difficult to implement.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more conversations around, I think people are more comfortable with operationalizing FAIR. There's still conversations and potential trajectories around operationalizing the CARE principles, whether you go for local knowledge context labels, that sort of thing. Yes, I think that's still an emerging field.
FAIR comes from a very scientific, biomedical, black or white. You've either achieved it or you haven't, or you're partway there. And CARE data principles and Māori data principles is quite difficult to get that, yes, I've done it, no, I haven't. So it's just the conversation is quite different. And I think because people can get used to, well, I've done the FAIR data principles or I haven't, but I'm working towards it. They want that same dopamine hit of I've done it, when CARE data principles and Māori data sovereignty principles are just not that. They're so contextualized.
Levi has a question. We have seen lots of policies over the years. How are you able to bridge the gulf between policy and usable solutions for researchers?
Good question. Couple of clauses come to mind. So the two of the writers, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus as one of them, two of the main writers for the policy are quite the sorts of people who like really black and white instructions. So the policy kind of reads that way. So for example, one of the clauses talks about where you should store data. So we've said if your data is sensitive or restricted, it should be stored on, and then specified a description of university managed research data storage service. Now those can change, the underlying technology can change, but that's like a number of things you could list on your hand. So it is quite prescriptive in some parts, and in others where we've said about data management planning being something that you do with sensitive or restricted data, because we don't have a system, we've been much less prescriptive because we can't be anything other than that. So I do get your point. I hope where we can, we've been quite clear.
Yeah, because from our experience with all the researchers most people think fair policies are a great idea, and they really love their data to be shared more widely and be reused. But the goal from the falling down point is the fact that is finding the repositories, the infrastructure and the mechanisms where I run a facility, so they ask, well, where can we put our data? And there lacks the structure and the actual repositories in place for them to actually go, oh, here you go, here's your 50 terabytes of data or whatever it is. We can put it on this server. This is the appropriate places, and then everybody will be able to find it. We seem to be at this point where there's a lot of policy, and some universities are in different positions how advanced their data management systems are. But from the research point of view, they want to be able to they want it to be prescriptive. They want to be told, okay, there is this service available to you. This is how you do it. This is how you put your data in. Then you'll get a DOI. Then all the other researchers around the world will be able to find it. But at the moment, we seem to be there's a bit of a kind of impasse where they're told, the researchers are told that they must do all these things, and this is what the requirements are. But there's not. This is how you can do it.
It's in particular for
I know
Levi.
David's very familiar with it.
No, but just like Levi, I agree with you, and Emily also agrees. But for example, like where to store data, that comes from data security classification. And my experience at many universities in Australia, you don't find that in data management. You find that is more like IT, cyber security section of policies, which I understand where it is, but it also affects data management. So it's not the first place you would go to find your data management information. So sometimes many people are involved in data management across a university, and it can be very difficult to know who is in charge of what.
Yeah, and I think this is probably where we have been very successful, is the people that we've brought into the conversation with us. So whilst we do a lot of engagement with researchers, when we're writing policies, the people we had on our working group represented the School of Graduate Studies, the library, IT, records management, the planning office who do a lot of the reporting. So all the people that had a vested interest in, well, what would this help me do? How is this going to help the boat go faster? So what I think I'm particularly proud of is that we have brought those things that were otherwise siloed in IT or somewhere else into the context of research data. And then we have a thing within the university called the Research Hub, which is an internet site where we park all of our researcher-facing services and things that they can book or information about. Yep, there's a link. And that's where we will contextualize guidance for writing a DMP using the data classification in the context of research data for our audience. And that's what we're hoping to get out of the institution consultation around the policy, is not, hopefully, although I'm sure we'll get it, please can you rewrite the following clause in the following way? But okay, so if that's what we're doing, how am I going to learn about how to do that? Where is that going to be? What mode of communication do people want that to be in? How much detail? That's where we see the questions now is, how is this implementable? Hopefully we've moved beyond the, should we be implementing it?
Yes. And I think like what you mentioned, just having all the people with a vested interest in data management to sit at the same table, being able to identify those people first, and and then having all of those people to talk to each other to develop like a common platform is already the first step. It seems very trivial. That's not. That takes time, a lot of time, and a lot of engagement. And Emily, you mentioned ARDC that advise institutions on data management. So for example, there's the institutional underpinning program that the ARDC has been running. Unfortunately, that is to uplift the universities but that doesn't mean that it's direct guidance for the researchers how to do data management. It's up to the universities in a way to also do that. Any more questions for Laura and Yvette? I have one actually. In some of the recommendations that came, you had one that was shelved about an institutional data catalog or something like that. Does that mean that University of Auckland does not have an institutional repository, or you chose to have another model?
We have an institutional repository. So we have an institutional Figshare. Thank you, Patrick. And people do use it. That's not quite what we meant. So that's a repository, but we don't have, if people aren't publishing their data or are choosing to publish it in Zenodo or some other disciplinarily specific repository, we don't have any sight of that. So having an institutional catalog would be more of a registry of data sets wherever they may be parked. And that was deemed, understandably, as too big to try to bite off.
Yes, because you don't know what sort of monster you're creating.
Yes. But we console ourselves with, if the data management planning tool is used the way we hope, then we will be able to get a similar picture or a proxy of some of that information by reporting against it as a database, if you like.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we stop here, and we can all thank Laura and Yvette for their great talk. And it's great to show that data management is a journey at university, and wherever you start, sometimes you start quite advanced, or sometimes you have to start very humble and very small. And that's really great. And I think the conversation on Māori data sovereignty is very interesting. I think it's something that maybe can be very relatable to Australian universities. Thank you all for attending